Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today to talk about dealing with difficult employees. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Leanne Lambert. I am the founder, co-owner and MD at Lighter HR. I've got many years of HR experience, more than I'm really happy to admit to now. But I started off my career in an in-house role, so I spent the first 15 years in various in-house roles. So I got a lot of experience of dealing with difficult employees there. Since then, I've spent the next 15 years being an HR consultant, so I've got lots of experience with helping our clients to manage difficult employees. But I'm also a business owner, and as much as I own an HR consultancy, we are not immune to having our own HR challenges, even though people think we should be. There's definitely been times where I've been sat where you are with a difficult employee that I've really been trying to kind of struggle through. How do I deal with this particular person? Now, just to say, not in our current team. Our current team are fantastic, but historically, I say I've definitely been sat where you are, thinking about how do I deal with this person. Before we get into kind of the real content of today, there are just a few things that I need to say. Firstly, people issues are complicated. We're going to talk today about some generic situations and some generic tactics that you can use to deal with those situations. But we do suggest if you have a difficult employee that you're trying to manage, then do get some professional guidance specifically tailored to your situation to work out the best way to move things forward. And again, just to confirm, as always with these sessions, there is nothing that we say today that should be treated as us providing your business with professional advice. So a little bit about Lighter HR. So this is our 15th anniversary. I thought it would be a great idea to set up a business in the height of a recession and spent many hours sat on the kitchen floor with demons on each shoulder at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, oh, you're never going to make this work and you'll never get a job and you're going to have to sell a kidney in order to make things kind of financially viable for you. But here we are, 15 years down the line. It's certainly been a challenge to get to this point, but here we are. Our primary focus is on providing HR support to organisations of any size who don't have their own HR or who just want to outsource their HR to us. Additionally, we do provide in-house HR teams with additional capacity. So it can be if they have a specific project that they want some help with, or if they need some specific expertise. Obviously, HR is a very broad area, so not every HR person knows all there is to know about everything. We've now worked with over 1,000 companies, and we are extremely fortunate to work with a great team for great clients doing work that we're really passionate about. So talking of that great team, they are on hand today to answer your questions. And so as I've gone through and written this presentation that I'm going to be delivering today, it's quite clear that there are some kind of generic tactics that I can share with you. However, with most things with HR, the devil's in the detail. So it could very well be that you'll sit there today thinking, yes, but I've tried that, but. So if you are kind of sitting there thinking, oh, yeah, but what about this? Over on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see that you have an ability to post questions. The team are waiting there and will be able to answer those questions for you. You can either post them publicly, in which case everybody who's on the call will be able to see them, or privately, in which case they will just come to us. So either of those, I say we are here to help. Just again, to manage some expectations, we will give you as much help as we can throughout the session if you do want to kind of engage with us. However, it could be that we'll recommend that you book a free meeting with us afterwards, which you can do just through our website, so that we can get into a little bit more detail, because again, we can't give real advice without knowing kind of more about the legalities of the particular employee, their contract, your policies. But yeah, we will try and be as helpful as we can during the session. So the agenda for today, we're going to have a chat about dealing with difficult employees. So we're going to first start by kind of talking about what we mean when we're talking about difficult employees, and kind of the situations that we have seen and kind of the common themes that we would say are associated with what our clients deem to be difficult employees. We're going to talk about anything that you can do to avoid difficult situations arising in the first place. And then we will also just briefly cover kind of the formal disciplinary process if you do find yourself in a position where you can't get things to improve. So we are going to do, our next webinar is going to be a lot more detailed on the disciplinary process. So this will just be quite light touch today, but do keep your eye out because we'll be running, say, a more detailed webinar on the disciplinary process towards the end of April. So let's get started then. And first we're going to talk about what we mean when we are talking about a difficult employee. So typically what we are talking about is employees whose behaviours make them difficult to manage. So this can be those people who are overly negative. They are the ones where anytime you want to make a change within a business, they are the ones that are going to put up the barriers, be difficult, and potentially even stir up those your other employees to make them negative about the change that they're trying to make as well. And they can also be quite disruptive. So again, you can probably, if you've had experience of these types of people, when I say these things, you'll have that person in your mind. You're like, oh, okay, it was you. Then we've got employees who have performance issues. So with them, this is not talking about performance that is so bad it's obvious that you need to get into kind of formal disciplinary and capability processes. It's those people where what they do is okay, it's just never quite where you need it to be. Maybe they don't perform to the same standards as the rest of the team. They are the people that do the absolute bare minimum, just enough to kind of stay under the radar, but it's really not helping you drive your business forward. And then you've got those employees who have timekeeping and attendance issues. So again, we're not talking about people who have legitimate reasons, so kind of people with disabilities where maybe you've got some attendance problems going on. But these are those, your typical Monday, Friday absence, the person that just always seems to have a reason why they can't be where they're supposed to be when they are supposed to be there. So that's what we're talking about when we are talking about difficult employees. I thought one of the best things to do to kind of really going to bring the subject to life a bit is to just give you a little bit of a case study around a real situation that one of our clients found themselves in. So obviously we're not breaching any confidentiality here, you're not going to know who it was, but this is just kind of a bit of a summary of their situation, but it is something that we've seen more than one client need to deal with. So when if internally we're talking about a difficult employee, there is always one case that will spring to mind. The client needed to make some changes in their business. The business had grown, the client base and what those clients were expecting had changed, and there was a need to put some additional cost control measures in place. So they implemented a range of changes. They put in a new dress code, just to kind of again drive. They had more clients coming on site, so they wanted people to look a little bit more respectable. They needed a new approval process for timesheets and overtime to make sure that the costs were properly controlled. And they also put in a new management structure. The growth had meant that whereas the directors had been managing a lot of the team, that was no longer appropriate or feasible. All of these changes together created a very disgruntled employee, and ultimately I think what was at the heart of the problem was that employee felt that they had started to lose their influence within the business. They had been reporting directly to the directors. When they lost that reporting line and when those directors started to try and create some distance, I think that was really what was at the heart of what caused the problems that kind of started to happen. So how did this typical difficult employee behave? Well, he refused to comply with the new dress code. Even though they had offered financial assistance to everybody to buy new clothes, it still wasn't okay with him. And when he was challenged on that, he then did comply with the dress code, but he chose to add a deerstalker hat, even though it was the height of summer. Just those things where you're, okay, you're just pushing the boundaries. When signing the newly implemented timesheets, rather than signing his name, he signed an extremely offensive word. And then he also refused to comply with the new process for getting approval for overtime. When the client then didn't pay his overtime, he raised a grievance for unlawful deduction of wages. So overall, the situation in the relationship just started to become untenable. What happened? The client didn't address the behaviours head on. They tried to tolerate the bad behaviour and the disruption from the employee. Again, I think there were a number of drivers behind it. Firstly, they were very busy. Secondly, there was that acceptance that change is hard, and I think they had hoped that things would naturally get better on their own. They gave him some extra flexibility and they made some allowances. They tried to work around him, and then they ran out of patience, and that's when it all went wrong, because basically they snapped, they fired him, and he did then bring a claim for unfair dismissal and age discrimination. He was 42, and he was successful in that claim. So when you're then thinking about employees where their behaviour is difficult, what should you be doing? So the first thing is you do have to address the problem. So we'll talk a little bit more about when it's an appropriate time to step in as we kind of go through the session. But it is important that you don't allow situations to fester and get to the point where you lose your patience and snap. You need to do it when you're calm and before the situation escalates. So not only are we talking about here before you've kind of got to a point where you're going to snap, you just also want to make sure you have a conversation when you're not in the height of an emotional response to the latest thing that this employee has done that's been difficult. You need to give the employee the opportunity to talk about what's bothering them. You then need to set some clear guidelines around what is and is not acceptable. And you also need to explain what's going to happen if things don't improve. Again, this is not about making threats, but it is just about being very clear that how somebody is currently behaving is not okay with the business, and that you do need to see things changing. And then you need to make sure you follow up. What can happen is you kind of build up the courage to have the initial conversation, particularly if it doesn't go quite as well as you planned. You then back off and you go back into that habit of letting people slide, letting poor behaviour slide, and then you do again risk getting to that point where you are ready to snap and just need somebody to go away. So if you're going to have the conversation, just again some tips and tricks that I'd like to share with you, not really just about these types of conversations, but overall, if you're going to have more challenging conversations with employees, what are some of the things that I would suggest and recommend? So the first thing that I would say is don't overplan. This was definitely something that I was very guilty of in the past. I would spend hours with an internal dialogue. I'll say this, then they'll say that, then they'll say that, then I'll say this. Obviously, there's two issues with that. Firstly, the conversation never ever went as I thought it was going to go. And secondly, I was exhausted before I even started, meaning that I was far less able to deal with the conversation as it was unfolding in front of me. So you want to plan for certain, but just make sure you've kind of got some bullet points down, maybe kind of your opening sentences, because that can be the bit if you're dreading a conversation where it can get a bit awkward and stuttery. So maybe just kind of plan out your opening sentences, the key points that you want to cover, and then just as quickly as you can move on to having the conversation. So this kind of falls into the next point, which is around don't wait too long. As I say, that's don't wait too long in terms of letting things really fester, but also once you know you need to have the conversation, try and get on and have it. One of the things here, though, is to think about when is the right time to step in to a situation. Just because somebody's having a bad day, you don't suddenly want to be thinking, I need to have a formal conversation with them. And if it's you want to be looking for a pattern of behaviour. You don't want that pattern to go on for many, many weeks or months. But if you see something happening kind of a couple of times, something that you think is not okay, that's when you want to be stepping in to have a conversation. Because also the quicker you have the conversation, the less likely you are of that type of behaviour becoming just embedded and accepted within both the organisation and the individual. Another thing that I would say when you're going to be having a conversation with an employee, regardless of kind of what it's about, is remember you don't know everything that's going on. It can be really tempting to jump to conclusions and start to assign motive. They're doing this thing to annoy me, they're doing this thing because they're lazy, they're doing this thing because they're disinterested, they just want to be difficult. All you're really doing then is making the conversation harder for yourself, because you're going to be coming at it with a whole load of emotion behind it. Well, ultimately, just try and stay factual. What is it that they're doing that's not okay? You don't know why they're doing it. Let's try and see if we can find out why these things are starting to happen. It is really important to be honest. in these conversations. So if you kind of sat with an employee and they are very articulately explaining to you why this change that you're trying to make is making them unhappy, or why this thing is making them unhappy, if it is as it's going to be, then don't make false promises around kind of changes. It's absolutely fine for you to be quite direct and explain that, yep, this process is in place because of these reasons, and we're not going to be changing it. And it's important that the individual that accepts that. So being very direct will make things a lot easier. The next thing to think about is whether or not what the employee is saying needs to be treated as a grievance. This can be a little bit harder to manage, and again, I fully appreciate when you're sat there, the last thing you want to be doing is encouraging employees to raise grievances that are going to take up many weeks of your time and potentially be quite disruptive to the business in terms of doing investigations and talking to multiple people. So whilst you don't want to kind of encourage grievances, it is really important that if you are sat with somebody who is deeply aggrieved by something, that you do ask the question, how do you want us to move this forward? Do you want us to try and resolve it with you informally, or do you want to move to a formal grievance? Again, as much as it can be, you can feel like you're looking for problems by offering somebody the grievance route, you're going to save yourself a lot of time if you do go down a grievance route when you should, rather than have an employee potentially resign, bring a claim of constructive dismissal because they told you about their problem and you didn't treat it with the appropriate level of severity, and therefore you find yourself in front of a judge unable to demonstrate that you did take action regarding an employee's particular issue that they raised. So I do understand the kind of reluctance to talk about raising formal grievances, but actually sometimes going through a very structured process with an employee who is being difficult can be really worthwhile and can get you the outcome that you need. Whatever type of conversation you have, whether it's formal or informal, do make sure you follow up in writing, just to confirm these are the things that we've talked about, this is what we've said you're going to do, this is what I've said I'm going to do, just so that you have some sort of record, again, that if issues have been raised, you are looking to resolve them. And then do make sure you keep on top of the situation. Do have regular reviews with people who you've had kind of difficult conversations with. And again, make sure that you don't allow behaviours to slip backwards, because if you've said it's not acceptable, then it needs to always be not acceptable. Otherwise, it's kind of quite mixed messages to employees. So we've talked there about what happens if you have an employee who is behaving badly and the sorts of things that you should be doing. So talking to them, making sure that things are documented. But are there any steps that you can take to prevent these types of bad behaviours developing in the first place? The things that we would suggest are making sure that you have some documented company values and expectations. This is really important, particularly as businesses grow. So one of the things that you can see within organisations is that you start with a relatively small team. And as people join that team, they naturally sense how people behave, what your expectations are, kind of how they interact with colleagues. But as your team grows, that can become diluted. And if you don't have anything written down, then it can be a lot more difficult to have those conversations. So it's definitely worth kind of spending some time just writing out what your values are and how you expect your team to be engaging with each other. Very similarly, professional conduct policy. This can actually help with a whole range of issues that can arise with employees. But again, making sure that you're clear when you're talking about professional behaviours, what it is you're expecting to see. So behaviour framework, this one is more optional. The first two I definitely recommend you do. With a behaviour framework, what you're really looking at there is probably for a slightly larger organisation where you've got multiple levels. And what a behaviour framework starts to do is set different expectations of behaviours depending on your seniority within an organisation. Obviously, as a senior manager, you are expecting people to behave differently to a more junior employee. So not relevant to all organisations, but maybe something to consider if you're 40 to 50 people, and want to put a bit of more structure around your behaviours. The last two, again for all organisations, make sure you have some open channels of communication. One of the things, if you are an owner-managed business, one of the things that can be really difficult is you think you are approachable and that people should just be able to come and talk to you about things. But the reality is they're not going to. There are many people who will feel you're the boss, they therefore don't want to come to you with things. They won't feel it's an appropriate use of your time. As much as you may not feel you're intimidating, for some of your team you may very well be intimidating. So you do need to think about what routes have employees got in order to kind of raise issues and concerns. So within our own organisation, actually, as much as I think everyone should just be able to come and talk to me, we've actually appointed an employee rep. And if there are people with issues that are important, but not important enough for them to want to come and talk to me, then they can raise it with the employee rep, and that kind of gives us an opportunity to kind of help drive our business forward and make sure that employees do know that there's somewhere for them to go. And lastly, like we talked about before, is making sure that you're honest. If things are as they're going to be, just be clear about that. Your employees do have a choice as to whether or not they stay with you. And there's no way you can run your organisation in such a way as to try and keep everybody happy all of the time. So that's if you've got an employee who we would say is difficult due to behaviours. Then you've got those employees where actually it's a performance issue. So again, a little case study of a real situation that we found. The client contacted us to explain that they needed to dismiss somebody due to poor performance. So we did all of our normal checks, looking at length of service, protected characteristics and employee history. Through that, what came to light is the employee performance wasn't awful, but it had never really been where the client needed it to be. However, that was never reflected in any of the performance appraisals that the employer had been conducting. So in short, the employee had just never been told that there were any issues. So in that case, what we told the client was they can start a formal disciplinary process if they wanted to. However, that was likely to trigger an extreme reaction in the employee. If you think about it, if you were to be sat there thinking that everything was fine, and the first time you were told that it wasn't was because you were invited to a disciplinary hearing, you're unlikely to react well to that. We also talked about looking at maybe two alternatives. Firstly, having a conversation just as part of the performance appraisal to give feedback and monitor improvement. So the performance appraisal was coming around again, so that they could have that type of conversation there. Alternatively, moving to a performance improvement plan. So performance improvement plans, commonly referred to as PIPs, are not legal tools. They're not recognised in employment law at all. But they are a really useful way of making sure that you have been very clear with an employee. These are the concerns that we've got, and this is what we need you to be doing about them, and being clear that if you don't see the change that you need and the improvement that you need, then you may have to go down a formal route. It's really just kind of a bit of a warning shot that's slightly more serious than just saying to somebody you need to get better, but falls short of starting formal disciplinary. But again, if you're going to use performance improvement plans, just be mindful of the fact that they don't form a part of a legally recognised disciplinary process. So again, probably worth coming back to us, to the webinar that we'll run at the end of April, where we'll talk in a lot more detail about that whole disciplinary and capability process. So the best approach if you have performance issues, it's going to be very similar to what we talked about with behaviour issues. You need to raise the concerns as soon as they happen. You need to give regular and honest feedback. You do need to consider whether there is anything that can be done to help the employee reach the required standards. You need to make sure that you're listening to the employee to see if there's any underlying reason for performance concerns. This is particularly valid if somebody has always performed and you suddenly see a dip in their performance. It's probably an indication that something is going wrong. People don't generally go from being good at their jobs to being rubbish at their jobs unless something has changed. So if that's what you're seeing, So obviously in the scenario that we've talked about, the person had never actually been very good at their job. But if you have an individual where performance has been good and then it suddenly starts to drop off, then definitely worth having a quite detailed conversation before you launch in to manage performance to understand what's going on. If you're doing appraisals, do make sure that you are addressing concerns through it. There are too many times when we have people kind of skip through the performance appraisal process because it's quite onerous in terms of time. They're not really ready to have difficult conversations. They really just want to get it done. But it's really unhelpful if later on down the line you want to start managing somebody's performance, but again, you've got a performance appraisal that you did 3 months ago that told them that everything was fine. If that general feedback process doesn't work, then do put a PIP in place. And again, if that doesn't work, you can move forward into more formal disciplinary action. So the last thing to kind of touch on is frequent absence. And again, I want to be really clear on this. Absence can be tricky to manage. And it is something that our clients typically are concerned about. If they have got somebody with absence issues, there are a number of reasons why people want to back off and just kind of let the situation be. One is concerns about issues relating to disability discrimination. There can also be concerns around, I'm going to hear something that I don't really know what to do with. So they again try and avoid conversations about topics that could be quite sensitive. And also there is a sense of, well, I genuinely believe this person is ill, so there's really not much point in having a conversation to say that we are concerned about their absence levels. So we're just going to talk through these 3 areas. When it comes to disability discrimination, again, yes, you are right to be concerned around having conversations with an employee who has a disability around their attendance. So just as a reminder, disability is a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act. So if an employee does have a disability, you are required to make reasonable adjustments. Now, those reasonable adjustments can come in many different guises. But one of the things could be that if somebody has a health condition that is classified as a disability, then you may need to be accepting of higher levels of absence. Being clear, however, you don't have to accept that they're never going to turn up for work. But in order to make that allowance, you do need to be aware of the disability or have reasonable cause to believe that there is a disability. You shouldn't not have a conversation with somebody about attendance because you have a fear that they may have a disability. If you handle the attendance conversation appropriately and sensitively, then it could be that will be the process by which somebody is going to explain to you, I do have this health condition. If you need help with managing absence with somebody with a disability, then do reach out. So we're talking here about you don't know that there's a disability, you should have the conversation. If you do know that there's a disability, but you've still got concerns about absence, I'd strongly recommend you get some professional guidance before you launch in and have a conversation around their attendance rates. When it's genuine absence, is there any point in having a conversation? So again, we will have people that we'll encounter across times who just happen to have a really bad run of luck. They just seem to catch thing after thing after thing, and it kind of impacts their attendance rates. I do think it's worth having a conversation still. The nature of the conversation may be slightly different. Ultimately, probably what you're trying to do is just understand, is there anything going on that's kind of contributing to an increased level of illness within a particular individual? Is there anything the business can do to help? So if it's kind of a temporary situation, let's say maybe somebody's gone through a very, very stressful time and it's increased the number of migraines that they're having, or they've just suddenly become, because they've got a bit run down with everything they've been managing in their personal lives, they've become more susceptible to picking up bugs. You could talk to them about, do you think it would be worth using some holiday time to take a bit of time off? If your business offers kind of additional paid leave, you might want to talk about maybe just take some time off. If they are able to maybe increase the number of home working days for a little while to kind of recuperate and recover. It is definitely worth exploring with an individual whose absence levels are suddenly higher, whether or not there's anything that the business can do. Equally, you are fine to be able to have a chat with the employee to understand what they are doing to manage their health. Again, it can feel quite an awkward conversation, but you are within your rights to say, okay, this is what the business could do, but what steps are you taking to make sure that you are kind of managing your health appropriately? So a general approach to having a conversation around absence is to think about explaining to the employee that their absence levels are higher than your company average and that you're looking to understand the reasons for that. For some individuals, just knowing that what they're doing is higher than everybody else will be sufficient to get their attendance to improve. Other times, if it is genuine absence, there is no conversation that you could have that's suddenly going to go, okay, well, I'll get myself into work more. You do need to look and see if there are things that you can do as an organisation that is going to improve the attendance levels. You can absolutely ask the employee to kind of talk about what they are doing to improve attendance, and you do need to be clear that you are looking for some level of improvement. So again, when it comes to managing difficult employees, and if your difficult employee situation is around absence, they are the more challenging ones. I'm not going to deny it, and it is probably worth you always getting a little bit of extra help before you kind of start those conversations. So we've now talked about those behaviours, those employees where they are difficult because they are behaving in a way that's not acceptable to the organisation. We've talked about employees where they are difficult because they're not performing in a way that's acceptable to the organisation. We've then had a chat about employee absence, and now we're going to look at the formal processes. So you've tried everything that we've talked about now would be those more informal stages, but now you've had the conversations, you've done the PIPs. What happens next? So you've really tried everything to get these situations to turn around, but you now need to kind of move to a formal disciplinary process. So firstly, you should have a disciplinary policy. So it is always worth making sure that you review your specific policy. So here I'm talking about the generic steps that you will go through, but it's always important that you have a look at your disciplinary policy, and that's particularly important if your disciplinary policy is contractual. So most disciplinary policies won't be contractual, but for some of our clients, they do have disciplinary policies that are contractual. If you then go through a disciplinary process that is not aligned to your contractual policy, then you are going to be committing a breach of the employment contract, and that can have some quite serious repercussions. So the very first thing you need to do is just do a double check. Is my disciplinary policy contractual or non-contractual? Then within my disciplinary policy, what steps do we say that we will follow if we're going to go through a formal process? So typically what will happen is there'll be an investigative stage. Now, for performance issues, that's largely not going to be required. For an absence issue, probably your conversations that you've already had will form that investigation. So you typically have to do an investigation in a disciplinary situation if you're not really sure of all of the facts. So it's not always required, but do just spend a certain time thinking, do I have the information that I need to determine whether or not there is a disciplinary case to answer? If you've done your investigation and concluded there is a disciplinary case to answer, or if you conclude that you don't need to do a disciplinary investigation, but there is definitely a case to answer, the next thing that you need to do is write and invite the employee to a hearing, and you need to inform them of their right to be accompanied. So again, we're going to get into a lot more detail on all of this in the webinar at the end of April. But you would need to send them a letter. You kind of obviously set out the date and time of the meeting. You also need to set out the case against them and provide them with the evidence that you're going to be using, and you need to make sure that you provide them with sufficient notice. So typically we will say 48 hours notice between them getting the letter and the hearing taking place. And when we talk about what the case is against them, here what we're talking about is just making sure you set out very clearly the concerns that you've got that you're going to be discussing at the meeting. It's very important that you are accurate in the invitation letter, because what you can't do is talk about additional problems and concerns that you've got in the hearing. You can only talk about the things that have been set out in that letter. So you write and invite them, and then you actually conduct the hearing. Within the hearing, you'll do your introductions. You will then present the case that the company has, kind of the concerns that you've got, and then you will allow the employee to respond. And then you have to listen to everything that that employee has to say. So again, please make sure that you don't go in there with a predetermined outcome. Whilst it can be very tempting to think, I know everything there is to know, and this is just a box ticking exercise, it is really important that you let the process do what the process is designed to do, which is make sure that you really have got a full grasp of all of the relevant information before you decide on kind of appropriate disciplinary sanctions. If you go in with a predetermined outcome, you just risk missing something. So having had the hearing, the next thing that you will do is consider everything that the employee has had to say, and then you will decide on a suitable outcome. So outcomes are typically first written warnings, final written warnings, or dismissal. And again, what that outcome is will depend entirely on the case that you are dealing with. It's also very important that within your disciplinary process, whether or not you have any ability, so within your disciplinary policy, whether you have any ability to skip steps, or whether you are very clear that you will always follow first written warning, final written warning, and dismissal. Also, when you write, when you've decided what your outcome is, you do need to write that to the employee, confirming what you've decided and also advising them of their right to appeal. So this is really high level on disciplinary process, but again, we'll talk about it in more detail at the end of April in the session that's specifically on disciplinary. So that's everything for today. So for a quick summary, if you have a difficult employee that you're dealing with, the approach is typically going to be the same regardless of whether you're dealing, the difficulty is coming from behaviour, performance or absence. When you notice that there's an issue, you are going to step in and you're going to speak with the individual. But like we talked about, you're going to judge, is this just a one-off that we can leave? Is it a pattern of behaviour? You don't want to be jumping on everything because that's going to make your life difficult and it's not going to kind of be conducive to a positive relationship. But as soon as you can see that there is a pattern or that there is a particular kind of a more serious issue, you are going to speak to the individuals and just make sure that they are aware that there's a problem. During those conversations, you're going to make sure you listen to anything valid that they have to say. Again, one of the tips that I would have here is if you are having these kind of more difficult conversations and employees are being quite combative with you, try if you can not to become defensive. It can be very easy to want to put them right on everything that they are saying, but sometimes it can be more useful to just step back, let them say everything that they need to say, let the emotion to kind of move out of the situation, and then come back and try and get them to be a little bit more reasonable. When you have these types of conversations with employees, make sure you are agreeing an approach for moving forward. So if it is an employee is particularly negative, and are causing issues within the organisation by talking to lots of people and being negative with lots of people, it could be that you're going to want to tell them, no, if you've got problems, then you need to take them to your manager, or kind of giving them like the right channels through which they should be communicating. When you had conversations, do make sure you monitor kind of what's going on and stay on top of things. If things aren't improving, do make sure you move, and you've said that you may move forward to a formal process, do make sure you do so. The final two tips would be don't ignore things and get some help. If you are finding yourself in situations that you're not completely clear of the safest way to move forward, there are lots of ways that you can get some help. So obviously we are here. We do offer free 30-minute consultations. You can book these through our website. But if it's not us, then please do make sure you reach out to somebody if you've got a particularly sticky situation, and do so sooner rather than later. You will all be aware, I am certain, that there is an awful lot of employment law change coming. And as much as there is still a lot of uncertainty as to exactly how it's going to look, one of the things that is absolutely certain is that everybody is going to be receiving their full employment rights from much earlier on in their employment. So at the moment, employees don't get their full rights until they've had 2 years service with you. Under the new Employment Rights Act, it is likely to be that they will have their full rights from day one, with maybe some variation as to how you can dismiss employees during probation periods. But ultimately, with the timing of that change coming, Anybody who joins your organisation from here on outwards is likely to receive their full employment rights earlier than 2 years. So if you have got problem employees, whilst you can't prepare for all of the employment law changes that are coming, one of the things that you can do is use now as your opportunity to make sure you are dealing with employee issues. Don't let them fester for very much longer, because it will instantly, from kind of, it's likely to be from April next year, it will become much, much harder for you to dismiss people. So any little underlying employee issues that you've got out there, now is the time to deal with them. And that is everything from me for today. Just to reiterate again, if you do have some employee issues that you'd like some help with, then you can book a free consultation via our website. So just go to lighterhr.co.uk. On any screen over on the right hand side, you will see your options around kind of contacting us and booking a meeting. So do make sure that you use that. Or if you are one of our clients already and are on this session, then make sure you reach out to your consultant. Or you can always contact me at leanne@lighterhr.co.uk. I want to thank you again for your time, and I do hope you found the session useful. We will get the invitation out shortly to the disciplinary session, where I say we're going to talk through in detail those steps for going through a formal disciplinary process. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.